Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our third panel of the day. The first panel focused on U.S. senior policymakers, and our second panel was principally dedicated to expert television commentators. And for the first two panels, Joseph and I and our team at SFS principally put those together. For the third panel, here's where the Division of Labor came with the Daniel Morgan Graduate School, as this third panel was principally put together by Frank Fletcher and Preston and their team at Daniel Morgan Graduate School. So as we talked about the senior policymakers and then switched to the expert television commentators, now we're going to take a deep dive into some of the tactical issues and some of the military issues on this panel talking about countering threat networks themselves. So we have 5 experts here to talk about that today. And the first, we have Secretary Mario Duarte, who is the Secretary of Strategic Intelligence for the Republic of Guatemala. We talked earlier today about how Joseph and I and Max Manwaring, Alan Manwaring, John Perdue, and our other colleagues with SFS have gone down to Guatemala, to Universidad Francisco Marroquín, which has been fighting for liberty for quite some time. Well, ironically, Mario went to college in the United States. He went to college in Houston and Rice as well. So he's very well versed in the United States and, of course, in Marroquín as well. So welcome, Mario. We also have Colonel Joshua Potter, who is from the U.S. Special Operations Command, the J-36 Directorate, Transnational Threats Division. Our Green Berets in the United States are at the tip of the spear. I had the great opportunity during my Navy career to be the spokesman for Special Operations Command Pacific, not long after 9/11. A lot of people hear about Operation Enduring Freedom, which was our military operation in Afghanistan. Well, we had them in other places too. We had one in the southern Philippines, for instance. And as our main battery for that, we were advising and training the armed forces of the Philippines to conduct counterinsurgency operations against a group called the Abu Sayyaf group, which was a splinter group of Al-Qaeda. It was really a group of thugs that just used Al-Qaeda, with Al-Qaeda people there to not just push the idea of jihad, but they were criminals too. But anyway, you don't get much more than the tip of the spear than the Green Berets. And of all the Green Berets, you don't get much more the tip of the spear than Joshua, because he is at the J-36 at SOCOM. So tip of the spear of the tip of the spear. Thank you for being here, Joshua. Sure. Then we also have Doug Farah. He gave his great remarks for Max Manwaring. We appreciate it as well. Doug was with us in Guatemala as well, down at Universidad Francisco Marroquín. And he was really a legendary reporter for the Washington Post, breaking great stories. He probably knows the most about Central American counterinsurgency operations, other than Max. I guess they're tied. I would say they're tied for first in the world. So it's an honor to have Doug here to join our panel today. We have Colonel Bill Edwards right now with the Thornton Tomasetti Group, and he's the former Director of Intelligence, the J2, at U.S. Special Operations Command North, so SOC North, handling intelligence for Special Operations Command that impact the north part of our hemisphere. And it's moderated by Colonel Tim Kiely, retired, and he's the Vice President of Exostrategies, also has been affiliated with NORTHCOM for many years, and he was in on the planning for this from the get-go. I remember Tim came to join me and Preston and Frank at DMGS to envision how this would come to fruition today, and it's an honor to have you back, Tim. So with that, thank you. Please take it away, Tim.
Okay, well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. It's nice to get away from balmy Colorado and come to chilly DC. When I left Denver, it was warmer there than it is here. So this is a great event, and this is a great topic, and we've assembled what I think is a very qualified panel to discuss some very hard issues. I was just told that this is now being called the old guy panel because we're all retired.
By who?
We'll find them outside. Right. And I would tell you, I think guys our age, and these guys are a little bit younger than me, we grew up in a military that had to shift rapidly from when we came in really looking at fighting nation states to this new thing called an asymmetric threat. We then had a brief 100-hour war called Desert Storm, where a lot of people said, you know, it is all about tanks and artillery. And we kind of forgot about the asymmetric threat, and then it hit us all very hard in the face on 9/11. And As that war kicked off, there was a lot of equipment left behind because we weren't structured to go out and fight networks. Well, now we look at our own hemisphere. You'll always hear the only way to fight a network is with a network, and that's absolutely true. But why are these networks so hard to fight? Well, number one, they're motivated. They're motivated by fear and hate and greed and very, very powerful things. Number two, they're very, very well funded. And number three, as we've experienced with other networks, they're absolutely willing and ready to die for maybe not what they believe in, but what they're being paid to do, or in some cases believe in it. So you say, how can you fight and win this war, which appears to be an endless war? Can you win it? Or can you only destabilize and desync your opponent so that you can get on with your life and live the way you want to live and have a society the way it wants to be? These are very powerful things. There is nothing that we have in our arsenal that people won't be able to buy today or tomorrow. Good equipment, good technology. It's out there, it's available on the market, and the better it gets, the cheaper it gets. So everybody at some point can kind of have the same equipment. Everybody at some point can kind of have the same tactics. We're right now training a lot of people on our tactics. So what's the discriminator? The discriminator is how you think about this, how creative you are, and how you invest in your human capital. And that's how you, in my opinion, you defeat these networks. So we have a great panel for you. We're going to start out with Mario. And some of these will be presentations. If you know Army officers, we're compelled to use PowerPoint. But the real thing here is to have a dialogue. So we'll go through as we need to.
Perfect. Go ahead. All right, let's start. Well, first off, good afternoon to everybody. I know we just had a big lunch, and I'll try to keep it interesting. I won't, apply something in the Army is called death by PowerPoint.
No worries.
I will try to avoid that, definitely. First of all, I would start with a message from President Jimmy Morales. He asked me to deliver a quick message to everybody, just to remind everybody and assure you that Guatemala is and remains a partner and an associate country of the United States. We will together keep fighting the good fight in trying to counter all these different threat networks, common enemies, common problems, and whatever the press might say, there are results that the U.S. government and different agencies know that Guatemala is doing and achieving with the help of the U.S. and all its different agencies. What I'm going to talk about, I'm going to separate it in a few different topics. I'm going to talk a little bit about drug trafficking, gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18. We're going to talk also about the different human trafficking organizations and all the connects, crimes that float around that specifically. A little bit about terrorism and how that is starting to become an issue in the Northern Triangle and the Central American region. And then I'm going to throw a little bit of some food for thought. And it's basically talking about covert political influence that's going on right now in Latin America, specifically from a specific ideology, and how that is almost becoming a criminal network in itself. Because we're seeing funds coming from different sources, not only from state actors, but also from criminal organizations such as cartels, etc., etc. Right, so real quickly, as you may see here, transnational threat networks have shown to have dynamic capabilities and logistics, specifically drug cartels. What you can see here is an effect that we see in Guatemala, most part of the Northern Triangle, is that we are simply the middleman in the cocaine route from South America to North America and Europe. What we have right now in the market is basically an oversupply of cocaine. It's flowing, it's all over the place. And the issue here is that it's almost, it's cost ineffective for the cartels to push the drugs all the way through to the United States. So what's happening is that a lot of those cargo and a lot of that cocaine is waiting in our countries for the prices to spike up, so they decide to push it up. So it's becoming really a problem for the cartels also, because they have to manage all those warehouses, illegal warehouses, and all the structures required to actually keep that cocaine safe in all these different countries as they are en route to the United States. We have different maritime routes and the different types of transportation they use. Now, with drug trafficking, and when you were talking about asymmetry, we have something called inverted asymmetry. Because of the amount of money cartels have right now and have had for a long time, most of our governments, especially the ones in smaller countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, has come to a place where these cartels have more capabilities than the government itself. What are we talking about? We have problems, for instance, in Guatemala with communications, with tactical communications for our security forces. And then we find these cartels, and they have tactical radios, tactical comms that go all the way from New Mexico and Texas, all the way down to Panama, Colombia, and they are just, clicking and communicating throughout the region. Well, our countries don't have that. We have actually had firefights where they have higher, in this case, weaponry and more firepower than our forces. However, still we have been able to dismantle most of the big cartels in Guatemala, which has led to a phenomenon called atomization. So we don't have 2, 3, 4 big cartels operating in Guatemala, but we have smaller groups now that don't have an actual real big leader, but just different people trying to become the new big drug boss. As successful as we have been days, and especially with all the assistance with the US, Mexico, Honduras, and El Salvador, the problem persists. And again, it comes to point and talking about the oversupply of cocaine, and I think the Honorable Congresswoman of Colombia could talk about that later as well. All these problems that also stem from political bad decisions all over the region. This is a little bit of our results. Just as you can see here, during the tenure of President Morales, the amount of seizures, cocaine seizures we have had, and they are, we're talking about billions of dollars. Okay. With very little cooperation, the programs that the United States has in Guatemala are not as big as what they have in Mexico and Colombia and other countries, where we right now are the ones that hold the records for cocaine seized in the entire American region or the Western Hemisphere. Some of opium eradication as well. Again, you can see this year we actually had to conduct a special operation in the western parts of Guatemala, in San Marcos and Huehuetenango, that pretty much was a denied area for the security forces. Basically, the cartels had taken over those areas, and they had all the citizenry there kidnapped, pretty much. So they were working for them. They were maintaining poppy plantation for them, and we finally decided that we needed to do something more direct, a direct approach, direct action, and we liberated these areas. And now the next step is actually to bring development to these areas, where again it's a little bit slower process, but it needs to be done. And the simple fact is that, let me put you in context with a little bit of history. After the peace accords were signed in Guatemala, one of the conditions put up by the guerrilla was that all the military zones, which basically are huge military bases, had to be demobilized, dismantled, and removed from our different states. What that created is basically a lack of power, of an emptiness of authority. So the next regular step was just someone, a criminal organization, came up and took over those different towns and different places. So now we have to recover all that capacity, all that state capacity that has been lost for almost 30 years. These are more of the captures we have had and all the different drug systems we have. Some of the risks that we face, and what I want to bring about this is that some of the best strategies that we have found that are successful in the region is basically, like you said, combat and fight a network with another network. Guatemala has led this effort in creating all these different groups and working groups. Specifically, I'll talk about three specific examples. One is the GANSECs. It's Grupos de Alto Nivel de Seguridad, or high-level security groups, where with different countries we come to these multilateral or bilateral accords to actually share information, but also coordinate specific operations against people, against cartels. This is how different people were captured. Just to give you an example, former governor of Mexico, Javier Duarte, nothing to do with me, by the way. That's through GANSEC that we had with Mexico, and the sharing of information and active information is how we actually managed to capture him. We also have similar accords with Honduras and El Salvador, and I'm proud of this. Actually, the next point. The idea to form a Transnational task force, security task force, was actually born in my agency with the help of Honduras and El Salvador, my counterparts there. The idea was to have these task forces led by intelligence, not in the sense tactically led, but making sure that the intelligence was flowing constantly to these people, making sure that we were sharing what they needed to make captures, to locate people, to locate targets, and we have been very successful at that. Beyond that, we also the third network that we have built, or was already built when I was there but wasn't active, is the different networks we have with the different intelligence agencies in the region. Specifically, we have three of them. One is called FOSI. It's a network of intelligence agencies that we have with Central America and South America and Spain. Then we have COINCA, which is only Central America, and then we have COICEPEM, which is another one we have with Central America, Spain, and Mexico. Again, these networks have been very successful in actually sharing information, sharing intelligence. We have built enough confidence for all these countries to actually send us, targets and targeted information, so we can find all these people of interest. And maybe not necessarily help them in conducting arrests, but definitely locating them, seeing what type of networks they are building in our countries. And again, trying to dismantle all these different groups that obviously pose a threat to the entire region. Now, when we talk about gangs, the United States has declared an open war against these groups. Probably, if I may, I think we all, the entire region, and I'm not talking about only Central America and parts of Latin America, but the entire Western Hemisphere needs to be worried about this phenomenon. Gangs are simply invasive, destructive, and they can become really not a migraine, as we were talking earlier today, but a real cancer in our societies, to the point where it destroys the fabric of our cultures. We're seeing all these different influences in Guatemala from Mexico, from different parts of South America. We're seeing now, for a while now, whenever there are captures, we can find all these, things dedicated to the Santa Muerte, this cult in Mexico. Then we have found voodoo priests and whatever in the middle of all these things. Now we're talking about a conservative region as well. So all these things start, chipping off of our, like I said, of our fabric, and at some point you start losing the next generation. And we're talking about our children. At this point, it's not so much the work that has to be done from the security and intelligence part in trying to target the leaders, capture them, dismantling the leadership of these organizations. We also have to work at the base level, deny them all that population of young children. In this case, then we're talking about collaboration and cooperation, development of all these countries. You have to remember that when there is a lack of development, in this case, like in the Northern Triangle, all these children really have no opportunities. Not all of them have the chance to, in this case, migrate to the United States, which is really one of the things they aspire to. Just go to the U.S., get a green card, have a better life. And personally, I believe that if you give a young person, two options, a good one and a bad one, they'll tend to go to the good. they'll prefer a good life, an honest life, than actually getting to the crime, a crime life. However, they don't have that good opportunity right now. They basically survive or survive. They don't have no other options. In this case, these gangs have been working that basically they aim at the hearts and minds of these people. They offer them a family, a huge family, riches, power, which pretty much right now it's not that difficult to see. They are as powerful as actually hitting the national police and almost any government employee whenever they want. They have no limits in access to firepower, no limit in access to influence. They can buy any will that they want. And they are not necessarily that big. However, they really are all over the place. From Los Angeles, California, Texas, Chicago, even here in Washington, all the way down to Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, starting to trickling down into South America. Good or bad, I know I'm not necessarily, different opinions on Nicaragua, but one of the good things about having a very strong police state like in Nicaragua is that they are not allowing these guys to grow roots in that area. But that's the only positive things about that. I'm not going to say any more about that. But it has allowed the gang phenomenon not to go as strong into Panama and Costa Rica and the rest of South America. But you have seen in Argentina, I think, they already did a couple captures of MS-13 members. And my only advice to South American countries is just make sure you get them from the beginning. Because if they grow roots, if they grow a base, it will become almost impossible to get rid of them. This is more or less the description of how these gangs operate. They are very violent. They work on things like extortion, contract killing, drug dealing, money laundering. Here, the issue here with money laundering and drug trafficking is that they are becoming so powerful. They have so much availability of cash. Like I said, now they have the ability to send people to college, put them in good jobs. We know for a fact that MS-13, which is of the two gangs the most sophisticated one, they have put people in banks working as tellers, working as agency managers, and that's where they start all these schemes to launder money and do other things. All right. Some of the ideas that we have talked about, like I said, and when it comes to gangs, it's basically we have to prevent them from recruiting more kids. And that's their base, children. Most of the leadership, which is above 18 years of age, all of them are, for the most part, in prison. And our prison system almost becomes a center of operations for them. They're safe, they're well kept, not necessarily well fed, but they freely operate from there. And now we have a problem also even with our laws, where you have all these children actually killing people, and we cannot judge them as adults. So what do we do with that? So we have to keep also constantly evolving our legal capacity to actually also make sure that these guys receive the necessary attention, not only from the legal aspect, but also from the human aspect. Talking also about how are we going to deal with all these kids that are mostly, they run away from home or they are abandoned by their families, they have nowhere to go. So who is going to take care of them? And talking about networks, in this case, most of the people will say, well, the government has to take care of them. Yeah, but the governments can only do so much. But this is where private enterprises come in, churches come in, NGOs come in, a network that really helps in giving all these kids, all these children, new opportunities. Now, we also need to talk about threat containment. Then I go back to the same thing we did with drug trafficking. All these cooperations between countries, between agencies, where we share information, we share targeting, and we capture these guys, put them in jail, whatever they are, wherever they might be. We also need to explore all these different legal situations to make sure that, in the case of the United States, if they are going to deport a person that was captured committing a crime and identified as a gang member, making sure that the country that's going to receive them also accepts the charges against this person. Challenges that we have to face as a region as well. And finally, penitentiary reform. our countries in Latin America, for the most part, policy mistakes and obviously acts of corruption, a lot of this infrastructure has been abandoned. Salvador and Honduras have taken great steps into developing maximum security prisons. Guatemala is working into it. We're working with partners. We're working with the U.S. We're working with Dominican Republic into building our own infrastructure of highly secure, maximum security prisons, just to make sure we can hold these people in there and make sure they don't keep being a bad influence in our country. Human trafficking. Again, this is only, for the most part, a connected crime of drug trafficking. They just evolve and into different modes of business for them. Guatemala being just basically a natural route to the United States, it becomes a bottleneck for human trafficking. Most people that eventually want to get to the U.S. as irregular immigrants have to come through Guatemala, be it from South America, being from the Caribbean, even from Europe, even from the Middle East, which will lead me into terrorism and our counterterrorism efforts. Now we're talking about also the abuse of all these people, because it's not only about human trafficking for the purpose of bringing people to the United States. We're talking about prostitution, sexual abuse, slave work, etc., etc., and for the most part for all these cartels. Again, in this case, we're talking about more integrated global solutions when it comes to countries, bringing development, bringing options for these people, making sure that they don't get close to the cartels, making sure they don't get to these coyotes, which are what we call the people, the organizers of these trains that bring people to the north. And also sharing of information again. Identifying the leadership, identifying the structures, identifying their sources of money is also a big thing here. Again, some of our in the last year we have 32 captures. Again, for President Morales, it's very important. This is a human issue here, because we have had children that are being sequestered from their homes, taken away, even being given in adoption in other countries. So it's a big problem here of a demand for something, for children, for lives. And unfortunately, it's not only a Guatemalan problem, it's a global problem. It's happening all over the place. In Guatemala, we just had a meeting with South Korean intelligence, because they detected a prostitution network that brings people from all over the world, and they have spas or prostitution houses disguised as spas with ladies from all over the world and children from all over the world, the most part. So those are things that we need to work on, in this case as a region, but also in general as a society. Now, counterterrorism. We've been talking about this. For the most part, people have ignored this threat in Guatemala or in the entire Central American region. We know for a fact that there are active cells, at least in Mexico, in El Salvador and other countries close to Guatemala. In the last year only, we have captured 44 people, most of them Syrians, with fake passports from different nationalities. From Guatemala also, we have found, or at least we have received intelligence from different agencies that they have found Guatemalan passports, real Guatemalan passports in Syria, in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is a real problem for us as well, because from the anatomical perspective, we're not we can be very similar to them, and God forbid, a Guatemalan passport is found in some cell here in the U.S., it would be catastrophic for our relations, because we would cease to be a trusted partner of the U.S. in the fight against all these threats. We have been very active, as you can see. In the past, we didn't really pay attention to it, but with the assistance of the United States and our partners around Central America, we have captured 44 people that we can talk about, actually. But we keep working at it, and we're detecting more things. And we are actually now just building more trust with all these different countries to make sure that we can actually share that active intelligence. Say we find a weird passport, may it be from Australia, from the United Kingdom, from from Italy, from Greece. It doesn't matter as long as we can quickly find out if it's a legitimate document, travel document. Now, I don't have anything nothing here on my presentation about what I'm about to talk, which is basically political covert influence. It might be a delicate, topic. However, we have been openly discussing it. We have countries like China, Iran, Russia. In this case, I might not agree with everything that has been said here. Russia is actively actually participating in all this political influence in Central America, at least in Guatemala. Maybe not with money, maybe not with active technology, which, well, actually they are doing it with active technology because now they have this big intelligence base in Cuba, also in Nicaragua, lots of weaponry, Russian weaponry now in Nicaragua as well. But also by using their old proxies from the Cold War, which is that they just handed over to new handlers. Now, who might be those handlers be? Could it be a specific political ideology? Maybe. Do I want to say a name? Maybe yes, maybe not. It's just a name that holds and owns a lot of media outlets throughout the world. I think you can figure out who it is. And it's really becoming almost a criminal enterprise. Why? Because all these political influence networks are using not only NGO money, at some times also U.S. money through some programs that have been fooled into giving them money, but also from illegitimate sources like cartels, like money laundering schemes. And again, they are trying to subvert democratically elected presidents and governments in trying to find ways to actually establish specific ideologically based and powered governments. And and I will say something, I don't think in my lifetime, at least in my lifetime in Guatemala, I won't see a leftist government being freely elected. And that's one of the things that's going on. The left in Central America and most of South America know that for the next several years they will not be able to win an election because of all the mistakes they've done, all the damage they have done throughout the Western Hemisphere. So they have to find a way to access to power. Now that's a little bit of food for thought I wanted to leave to everybody, which is basically we really need to look into this covert political influence. We, in Guatemala at least, we have networks of, someone said spies, yes, Cuban spies, Venezuelan spies, Nicaraguan spies, working actively in Guatemala, recruiting people, recruiting sources. And I don't think countries like the United States need to not do anything. I think you really need to do way more than has been done in the past, because otherwise you will have, if not a Venezuela, definitely, or possibly a Nicaragua just next door. Why? Because you will have a country that is in its geographical and geostrategic position a bottleneck of everything that flows into the United States: people, weapons, drugs. So having a government with those characteristics, I think, would be very, very detrimental to the national security of the United States and all the partners of the United States in the region. I will leave it at that. I'll try not to bore you more. Whenever we're done with the rest of my esteemed colleagues here, any questions you might have for me, I'm gladly take. Thank you.
All right. As we get these things up here real quick, I hate standing behind podiums, so I'm not going to do that crap. For those of you who I haven't met, and there's unfortunately way too many of you here in this room, hi, I'm Josh. Good to see you. I showed up in uniform for two reasons. Number one, I'm kind of proud of it. And number two is my boss said it was okay. I'll tell you, though, that from the United States Special Operations Command's perspective, the most important thing that we do is these public-private engagements. It's not just about bossing people around and telling them this is what we're supposed to be doing. It's about trying to build these types of networks that Joseph has done so diligently of getting you guys all in the same room. So I'm going to piss every one of you people who have a camera off by walking around right in front of you, screwing up your focus and everything else. But trying to make sure that you guys are not focused so much on your damn cell phones, and a little bit about some of the things that we're going to be talking about here today. I got 10 minutes and 10 slides, and that's it. Now I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to listen to your questions, and I'm going to answer every one of them that you guys have. Let me tell you what you're going to hear, bottom line up front. We have national security threats here in the United States. We call it the 4+1. 4 nation states are really being driven against us, which is Iran, China, Russia, and the Democratic People of North Korea. And the last one, which is the +1, not a nation state, violent extremist organizations. VEOs, now we go after specifically the Salafi jihadists and stuff like that, but VEOs also incorporate all these transnational criminal organizations, syndicates that are out there running amok. And further than just the TCOs that we're dealing with is a small subversion of those guys, which is the DTOs, the drug trafficking organizations. All drug trafficking organizations are, in and of themselves, transnational organized crime syndicates. So that's what we're really trying to get after. If we put everything under one big umbrella, it wouldn't work. We have different authorities, we have different responsibilities, and I'm not going to ask you for anything. I've got my own budget, I've got my own resources, but what we need to do is kind of come together with a common understanding, a common lexicon to look at the threats, the way that we see them, and we rely on people like Joseph, like Doug, and a couple of other trusted folks that are here, that have been working with us for a long time to help us understand these things better, because they see things we don't, they get to look at things we can't, they have access to people who I don't know exist. And when I sit there, and Doug came to me about 3 years ago and said, hey, we got a problem here in Latin America, and here's where it is, I said, geez, why isn't everybody doing anything about this particular problem? He'll talk to you about it in a second. I took it over to the intelligence community. I said, are you guys seeing this? This guy just came in here and just kind of blew my mind away. What can we corroborate? The answer was nothing. No, we're not looking at that. We're not seeing it. The reason why is because we weren't really looking at it, because all of our intelligence assets and all of our resources were committed elsewhere. We weren't looking at it. We weren't paying attention. So that's one of the reasons why we rely on these types of engagements in order to help us understand this 4+1, this national security threat that we're dealing with. Slide, please. Oh, wait. I got the damn thing, don't I? Let me make sure I get it right. Hey, it works. Okay, whenever we talk about intelligence analysts, I'm a picture guy, because I'm a guy and I like pictures. And we go ahead and make things real easy. When we talk to our intelligence analysts, we say, hey, look, there's 3 different types of networks that are kind of out there. The first one looks real simple. It's very separated. It's a smuggler's chain. Person takes from this point to this point. Next person takes from this point to this point. Next person from this point to this point. Real simple, real easy chain. The second one is kind of that cartel type of a star hub network, where you have one central strongman who kind of controls everything. Well, God, if you go ahead and whack that guy, everything else falls apart. Awesome. Okay, and then you have the third one, which we thought was the most dangerous one, which was that collaborative network where everybody kind of does everything. Everybody knows each other, and everybody has some sort of a comprehensive understanding of what the limited resources are, and they try to work with each other, but they know each other. That's what we teach all of our intelligence networks. Now, here's the problem. This is what a real network looks like. This is and I wrote it out in 2014 when I showed up at Special Operations Command the first month. This is what I got thrown to. The Center for Combating Terrorism at West Point pulled out, no kidding, 2,400? 2,700 known criminals and known terrorists. They looked at their cell phone numbers. They looked at their communications. They looked at their travel records. They looked at the people that they knew who were their known associates. They employed about 250 analysts to do this, and they made the connections. Over 15,000 different relationships, over 122 different countries, that found that 98% of these people knew each other. They were all somehow connected into one global DART network. That's not to suggest that the Illuminati are out there trying to control all this. Don't get me wrong. They're all driven by different things, but they were connected by some of the same things. They had the same documents forgers. They were bribing the same corrupt officials. They were using the same ports. They were using the same ships. They were using the same transportation companies. They were using the same banks, using the same bank accounts. Different organizations, different cartels were using the same banks. They were going to the same tellers. This proved empirically that a crime terror nexus exists. Happened in 2014 in June, my first day on the frickin' job. Awesome, because the intelligence community was telling me all up and down, no, this does not exist. There is no crime terrorist nexus. It doesn't exist. Bullshit. Sure it does. These are unfortunately the same intelligence community that was telling me that Lebanese Hezbollah is not in fact a drug trafficking organization. Not true. Okay? So we said, can we break this out a little bit in more detail? Can we look at these global threat networks by predicate crime? We tried. Didn't work. Didn't work. Because once again, when we did our own empirical analysis, we found that the VEOs were using the same smugglers for people and weapons that the drug cartels were using. Awesome. So we were like, there's got to be a way that we can do this. So we started working out partnership relationships with other organizations. DEA, phenomenal group of people. I love working with the DEA, especially their Special Operations Division over in Chantilly. But the DEA have been absolute champions when it comes to putting bad people away that I care about. And it's not because they're better shots than we are. It's not because they're bigger than we are. They have a bigger budget. It's because they can go after certain drug angles because everybody hates drugs. Everybody hates narcotics. And we have found that it is so much easier to get a successful prosecution in a drug case than a money laundering case, or than a terrorism case, or anything else. So the United States Department of Defense really started working with some of our other federal law enforcement counterparts. Homeland Security, one of the best things that came out of the terrors of 9/11 was the Department of Homeland Security, and to try to bring together things like ICE, things like the Customs and Borders Patrol, things like FEMA, for God's sakes, who had, deal with the responses for international responses. I mean, DHS was a fantastic and is a fantastic organization. One of my best friends and one of my colleagues is GS-15 and works right next to me, is from HSI, Homeland Security Investigations. They have successfully prosecuted people that are trying to kill me, my friends, and threaten our way of life. So God bless HSI as far as I'm concerned. Once again, I'm not asking for anything. I'm going to show you what a damn threat network looks like. Okay, kind of laid out, doom and gloom a little bit. We did something about it. In the Department of Defense, just this past year, we published Joint Publication 3-25. It's called Countering the Network. If you haven't read it, this is one of the graphs that we pulled out because we wrote it. And we came up with 11 different components to a threat network. And then we tried to explain a little bit about each one of them. I'm going to talk to you about one of them. We heard transnational organized crime is cancer. We've heard that it's a migraine. We've heard that all these other things. What I focus in on in my little shop, because I'm just a little guy, is this one right here, the financing. Financing in that anatomy of a network is the blood, because it connects everything. Nothing moves except through the financing. My division, Transnational Threats Division of the United States Special Operations Command, is the lead component for Department of Defense on countering threat finance, CTF, counter threat finance. Great friends in Treasury, great friends in DEA, HSI, and everyone else who's got a skin in the game here. But we deal with counter threat finance. That's kind of where I want to hit. We also are the lead for counter-narcoterrorism programs for SOF. And we have just kind of adopted the fact that we do counter-transnational organized crime because no one in the Department of Defense really wants it. So screw it, let's give it to SOCOM. So we did it. And I'm kind of running that one with Mr. Halsey over here, who's our deputy. Dave has been doing this crap since way before me. He left the uniform right about the time that I was coming into uniform from 7 Special Forces Group. Spent a lot of time downrange in Latin America. doing things that people write books about and shouldn't, because we don't like writing books. I've written 3. I regret every single one of them. But Dave has been one of those guys who's on that forefront and doing this for a long time. All the people who work inside of Dave and my shop, they're all civilians. Now, one guy, other than me, is in uniform. Got about 40 of us. And they're all retired FBI, CIA, HSI characters, or they came out of banks, they were fraud examiners, looking at the threat networks a little bit different ways. So we hire those types of people because they're angry, passionate, and they're all about national defense. So all the things that, like I couldn't pay these guys enough to care about what they do. They're really flipping good at it. So I like working with Dave and the rest of the crowd. Now, there's a couple things I wanted to look at, because we don't just look at one specific region. We look at the entire big blue ball, that globe. So when we look at something, oh, that sucks because the light, anyway. But we look at things like, and we have commissioned studies for things like trade-based money laundering. We can see and have seen, this is the unclassified version of the whole 9 yards. We've got a great report about 120, what the hell is it, 125 pages or something stupid like that. 125-page report on trade-based money laundering, all scrubbing down into where can we find some of those convergence points. And the convergence points that we found almost exactly mirrored legitimate commerce, a legitimate trade that's going through free trade zones, places like Panama, places, well, Panama blows. Because that's the one that I can tell you honestly, I am so happy that we worked with the DEA when they nailed the WHSF money laundering organization here last year, because that stopped $6 billion from going into the hands of Hezbollah and the Sinaloa cartel and other characters. So the WHSF money laundering organization that got busted up had I think it was 6 or 8 arrests. Now WHSF just last month pleaded guilty, didn't he? He just pleaded guilty. He's awaiting sentencing, as last I understand. And 68 businesses designated, freed up a whole bunch of things, Balboa Bank, all things went to hell. But it was all coming out of the free trade zone, and it was all coming through Hezbollah money. So to think that we're not doing something about it, not true. We are doing things about it. We're helping out all of our other federal law enforcement agencies, as well as, I'm going to keep walking by you, ma'am. I'm sorry about that. Okay. But we're working with our other law enforcement agencies, as well as the intelligence agencies, in order to kind of sit there and pick these things apart as best we can. In order to also highlight and illustrate why we're taking these operations very, very seriously. Going after trade-based money laundering, not what I signed up as a Green Beret for. I've had 10 tours in combat. I've lived in 16 different homes. And I've been on God's borrowed time for the last 11 years, because 11 years ago is when I got hit in Baghdad by one of those damn proxies, those Iranian proxies that was a Shia militia, the Jaish al-Mahdi, that decided to go ahead and send a 60mm mortar down my way. Got a little bit too close. And fortunately, didn't kill me. I think my wife would have changed the last phrase, but anyway. But we've also seen some very heavy things going into West Africa. The same type of activity that we saw that went after the Lebanese Canadian bank, money laundering schemes. Here's the problem. They still exist. Going after the used car lots and stuff like that Hezbollah continues to go ahead and dominate, they still exist. So we're working with the FBI, we're working with other federal law enforcement agencies to try to see what we can do in order to eradicate some of those things, or to neutralize it. Another global look that we did was we said, you know what? The Islamic State is principally funded through their oil trade. Who else is profiting through the oil trade? We took about 8 months, took a look at it, and this is what the unclassified version of what we came out with, which is and this is 2015 numbers, which we published in 2016. Out of the, what was it? I think it was $2 trillion, I think it was, of the oil mechanisms that were out there for the oil pipelines. About $15 billion of it was coming to the illicit side of the house. Most of this illicit oil market was being pumped out and used internally. In the own countries that they were pumping the fuel out, it was being used internally, most of it, with the great exception of Nigeria and Iran. Nigeria, Iran, and to some extent Venezuela. Venezuela, there's an interesting place. 100,000 barrels a day is moving out of Venezuela, principally going to Colombia. They're losing about $2 billion a year because they refuse to do anything other than think of themselves. There is no reason for this country to be burning in hell like it is right now. It is rich in resources. If it was managed properly by responsible and legitimate governments who cared about their own people, they would be fine. They would be doing well by any standards, not just Western standards, by any standards. They have chosen to live in a kleptocracy or to perpetuate a kleptocracy and to disavow any reasonable caring of their own people. That breaks my heart. So we can go into Venezuela in much greater detail. I know all the people up here, most people in the audience, know the drama as much as I do. But I just want to put that into a global context of what's going on inside of Venezuela itself. Last one I wanted to hit, oh shoot, I guess that was the last one. There it is. Last one I wanted to hit was this, which was, what are we doing about it? We have various authorities that we go after, whether they're law enforcement, military intelligence authorities, foreign policy. Let me get out of your way, sir, so you can go ahead and take a picture. Go right ahead, I don't care. But everything is focused in on that target, whether it's a terror group, a drug trafficking organization, or an organized crime syndicate. We have been starting to build these networks, and this is what they're looking at. These are kind of some of the tools and the activities that all these different entities are going after our targets. Now, you'll notice that in the outside of that little bullseye chart I'd love to create is a couple things. The financial industry, because I'm looking at counterfeit finance here, remember, on the left-hand side, and then academia on the right-hand side. We are reaching out. We talked about building in the younger population, the younger generation. We've gone out to and have partnerships with about 6 or 7 different universities where we talk to their professors, we work within their own programs, and we mentor students in order to create products and projects that we care about at SOCOM that we can publish and push out to all of our compatriots. By doing that, we have uncovered some great pieces to help us understand the supply chain that these terrorists and criminal organizations are actually using. They're doing it, and it's all unclassified, and some of it, I mean, it's very poor grammar, to be honest with you. But before the professors get to it, because we like getting in with the students, the younger students directly. But we like to take their raw analysis and what they think, and we learn an awful lot. Let me see if I can get that back one, because I really want to show that. Oh, there it is. The other one that we looked at was, and this came back from, what are the kids talking about these days? They were talking a lot about cryptocurrency and how cryptocurrency really works and where cryptocurrency works and why it works. What I didn't know was that Bitcoin, 51% of the Bitcoin mining is all centered in China. Who the hell thunk it? 25% of the Bitcoin is currently being mined in the Republic of Georgia. Having spent 4 months in the Republic of Georgia, I would not have imagined that cryptocurrency was being used there. Then I looked at where the mining was actually occurring, and it was being used by places that were very friendly towards some criminal organizations, Russian organized crime, as I believe. But the thing that came out was, how are they getting all the money into the legitimate financial system, or our international finance system? And a lot of it comes through these things called Bitcoin ATMs. Right now, I think 1,732 Bitcoin ATMs are in the world, plus or minus. That was on the 14th of November is when I last checked. Over 1,000 of those 732 were here in the United States. Here's why it matters. When you map out where those Bitcoin ATMs are, they're also in some of those population zones, those urban areas that are rife with drugs. Criminal gangs and drug trafficking organizations have been able to and can systematically eliminate the need for bulk cash smuggling through things like the use of Bitcoin ATMs. A Bitcoin ATM is something that you walk into, it's a regular ATM, you take fiat currency, that's $20 bills, $100 bills, stacks of them, you can put up to 20,000 in these damn things without raising an eyelash. Push them in there and it'll go ahead and populate in Bitcoin or whatever currency that you want. They use Dash, they use Bitcoin, most of them are Bitcoin. There's only like 3 others that are really popular in these ATMs. But they convert to cryptocurrency that can be extracted anywhere. We ran a test where we put $50 in outside of I think it was a liquor store in Chicago. Within 8 hours, that money was available for use for our affiliate who was over in London. All it needed was a QR code and its own private key in order to extract the money. So they walked in and said, okay, well, here's a QR code that was just texted to me from Chicago. There's a QR code, here's the private key, boom, it spits out $47 because a couple of the bucks were actually siphoned up from the transaction fees, about 8% to 20% in transaction fees, depending on which ATMs they're using. But it happened to be, over the course of that 8 hours, Bitcoin actually increased in value, so it wasn't so bad. In the last 8 weeks, Bitcoin went from, does anybody know? Since they did their hard fork on the 1st of August, it was $1,400 on the 1st of August, which is when I was giving a lecture in Atlanta, the day that hard forked. Today it's over $7,000. Hell of a return on investment if you get into Bitcoin. But that's only one of about 1,100 cryptocurrencies that are out there. There's really 2,000 cryptocurrencies according to Forbes magazine yesterday that I looked at. Most of them are not viable. About 1,100 of them are. Anyway. Last thing I want to go ahead and then I'll turn it over to Doug because I know I'm over my time. I apologize. Is why do we do this and why do we care? That's why. Everything we do is focused around operators. On any given day, we have about 8,000 operators in 80 different countries. We're not just in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and the Philippines. We are in those places where it's more difficult to be in, but it's important to be there. And that's what I want to just kind of impart upon you is we're not standing by, we're not idle. And the folks who are standing up here and anybody here who's ever served in uniform in this room understands that we are careful and passionate about what we do, how we do it, and where we do it. And our brothers and sisters that are out in harm's way that are part of this small special operations community are relying on the folks that are sitting here in this room to continue to expand that network and understanding amongst all of us, help us understand what you guys know, because I've only had 24 years of active service. Only the last 3 years of it have been looking at the problem like this. Inside of this room, I would venture to say I am definitely the youngin' of the group. I don't know who said that we were the old folks. That's crap. That's not true. But no, this is not the old guys panel. Some of us are relatively young and damned attractive, I might add. Again, my wife would disagree. But anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate you guys' time. If there's anything you can do, Michelle.
I'll take that. I'm not going to walk around with it. I don't have.
But you're also damn attractive too.
Well, thank you. Although my wife may also disagree. No, I think what's really interesting, and I've had the privilege of working with Josh and Dave for several years now, and some of the other colleagues that they bring into the mix, and I think as frustrating as it is for some of us who work in and around government and finding that policy and thinking is somewhat fossilized, there are dynamic pockets where it's not. And I think that what one of the lessons from Max Manwaring, that you need to think, and I think that is what you see in pockets around the communities, and when those pockets come together, you get really interesting, dynamic, and successful results. There are not nearly as many as there should be, but we're privileged to have here folks who are engaged in that. Joseph asked me to talk a little bit about something that I had mentioned earlier when I was talking about Max, and that is the concept, because people kept telling, when it started on all this transnational organized crime stuff, everybody kept saying, well, what's different? We've always had drug trafficking. We've always had these criminal issues. Colombia has been a violence problem for 50 years. And this is where I embarked on the concept of criminalized states, because it began, as I looked at the Bolivarian structures, looked at what became apparent to me over a period of years I grew up in Bolivia, and I speak Spanish. I was in the region all the time, and I was like, okay, spent 10 years living in El Salvador, and I was like, okay, what are we seeing here? Because I covered the drug wars as a journalist. I was living in Colombia during Pablo Escobar and the Cali cartel, the North Valley cartel, lived through the Salvadoran Civil War, and the Guatemalans and the Hondurans and the Nicaraguans. And so, yes, there were lots of problems, but something seemed to me to have fundamentally changed. And as I began to dive into this and think about it, based in part on my experience in West Africa too, with under Charles Taylor in Liberia and other things, that we had come up with a series of words to describe things in the post 9/11 world that sounded really good, and which I really liked initially, and which ultimately were absolute bullshit. And two of these concepts, one of them was failed states. We love to talk about failed states. I was working in West Africa at the time. Liberia was the top failed state in every index that everybody was putting together. And I thought, yes, what a failed state. They didn't have electricity, they didn't have hospitals, they didn't have roads, they didn't have mail delivery, they didn't have telephone service, they had nothing. But if you looked at it closely, and the more we're diving into this, it was actually an incredibly efficient state, because it was doing efficiently what it wanted to do, which is extracting diamonds, gold, and timber for the benefit of Charles Taylor. They did not care about the Westphalian concept of what a state is providing services. What they were able to do is create a very vibrant, functioning criminal enterprise as a government. And that was sort of a new concept to me. I thought, okay, that's really interesting. And if you look at the Bolivarians, when I came back to Latin America, there is a mixture, I think, of both. There's an ideology left. I think I think it's a mistake to view them as an entirely criminal enterprise, but it is also a united criminal enterprise with joint goals. And what binds them together, I think in the second panel they were talking, somebody was asking what brings these groups together, Iran and Russia, and with the Bolivarians, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and certainly now I would say El Salvador. And if you read their literature, which we spend far too little time doing, and this is one of the things I learned in working with Max, you read what they say, because Marxists and the far left love to tell you what they think. And they will write about it in great detail and explain it to you. And the huge mistake we make is not taking that seriously. So when they began saying, the primary enemy of humanity is the United States, and it is we not only have the right, but the duty to develop weapons of mass destruction to attack them, their allies, Israel and Western Europe. I was like, okay, so now we know why they are together. In their calculation, it was a north-south conflict, not an east-west conflict, that the South had, going back to the days of Daniel Ortega in 1979, in the triumph of the Sandinista Revolution. What did Daniel Ortega say every July 16th in celebrating the victory of the Sandinista Revolution? The Nicaraguan Revolution and the Iranian Revolution are twins, born of the same mother with the same objectives. And at the time when I was living there, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. They're not the same at all. But in their fundamental conceptualization of what the world looked like and how they wanted to remake the world, it was true. And so I think that looking at how states, the reason I came up with wanted to differentiate criminalized states from other types of corruption is that most narcos, most criminal organizations that we've looked at over time, 20, 30 years, that's why I'm the old guy up here, is that what do they want? They want a judge who will let them go free. They want a person on the border who will let their dope cross. They want a policeman on the coast who will turn a blind eye. They want a series of specific events or actions to be taken for their benefit and the benefit of their drug trafficking. What the Bolivarians brought into the equation, and they certainly weren't the first ones, was that the state began to look for transnational organized crime as an instrument of foreign policy to further their specific strategic goals. So you no longer had to worry about being caught if you were playing their game, and they were able to use what you produced, cocaine, illicit gold, weapons trafficking, for the benefit of their broader political project as well as your own benefit, because you certainly was not an act of altruism to join these things. But what does that offer you? And this is where I think when Josh was showing the slide of all of what a network actually looks like, how can they get to be that big? And why is it so hard to deal with them? And it comes, I think, to a fundamental misunderstanding that we have in policy circles and as nation states, and it's the way it is. It's not a criticism, it's the way it is, and I don't have a good answer on how to change it. When you're dealing with states that operate as a functioning criminal enterprise, you are dealing with an entirely different ballgame. General Breedlove, when he was commander of NATO, I was at an event with him, and he was talking about Russia, but I think it's applicable here. He said, we always get mad at Russia because we think they're not playing by the rules, right? We think that they're playing soccer, they kick us in the shins, we want the referee to pull out a yellow card or a red card and say, you committed a foul. He said, the problem is they're not playing soccer. They're playing hockey. None of the rules we think apply to them in the construct in which they are operating. They're operating with specific goals, with specific principles. They're completely outside of what we consider to be the norm and rules. So when we yell at people and want to sanction them and say, oh my God, they're not being nice to us and not playing, because they're not on the same soccer field we are. They're off playing basketball or hockey or whatever it is they're playing. And so we have to be able to reconfigure our thinking as in policy circles on how to deal with states that are in a completely fundamentally divided, separate reality, and what they view as legitimate. When Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez and Ahmadinejad began sending containers of cocaine from Venezuela to Iran, what did we think? Oh my God, that's illegal. If two states agree it's legal, it is legal between those two states. It may be outside the norms of what we consider to be decent and legitimate, but in their mind, in their conceptualization, is entirely legitimate how they operate. So I think in understanding what we're seeing in the region, particularly in Latin America now, it's useful to keep in mind that there is, and it's not one state. I grew up in Bolivia, we had in 1980 what they called the cocaine colonels. General Garcia Mesa took over, a drug trafficker, tried to convert Bolivia into the first narco state, and what happened? The United States said no, the neighbors said no, Garcia Mesa collapsed after 9 months. Desi Bouterse, in his first iteration as president of Suriname, the same thing. Drug trafficking, the Dutch said no, it's the former Dutch colony, they cut it off, and he was out of office very short. He's back now, of course, with Chavez, and when Chavez brought him back. But at the time, you could get rid of them. But when you have multiple states operating with a common agenda and able to provide things like what, and this is where it gets to what Josh was talking about, it's so difficult. You have access to passports, diplomatic passports, legitimate diplomatic passports that are then available to whoever wants to buy them. And if you have a diplomatic passport, you can walk through any border across any customs service, and nobody can do anything if your pockets are full of diamonds or gold or illicit gains. You can get access to beautiful things like shipping registries. That's why you see the same ships registered in the same shipping registry, because certain states are willing to rent their shipping registries out or allow them to be used. Aircraft registries, another beautiful thing. A whole series of things that accrue to you if you are in bed in a criminalized state. I think it's important to keep this in mind, because it didn't happen out of nowhere, and it became, and this is why I think the Russian connection, the Iranian connections are so important, because those are state-to-state relationships with states who recognize what the gentleman from Guatemala was talking about as legitimate warfare. If you read the Gerasimov Doctrine, the Russian military now, it's war by any means, pressing different pedals at different times, from cyber to diplomatic to economic to military when necessary. When they come back into the region, when Daniel Ortega is reelected in 2007, and then Sanchez set in, particularly when he consolidates the FMLN in 2014 in El Salvador, they're talking with people that they've dealt with for the past 40 years who have said publicly, we cannot wait. Jose Luis Merino, they say, we cannot wait. I wish the Soviet Union were here. The Russians show up. They speak Russian. They were trained in the Soviet Union. Boom. They're not plowing new and unfertile grounds. They're going back to their old friendships, as was mentioned. But it's fundamentally difficult in places like the Northern Triangle for the United States to operate when you have countries that are now specifically designing their internal doctrine and their external doctrine to break with the United States in ways that we will be very shocked at seeing. And one of the things when Josh was talking about how things, when all this money that can move, why can they move money the way they can? I'll tell you, it took me a long time to look at this and sort of begin to figure it out. It's actually an incredibly simple process for criminalized states to launder as much money essentially as they want to. Why? Because they realized over time, and you see this particularly in El Salvador and Nicaragua, now where places we're looking at, Suriname, where the state decides that it needs to launder a certain amount of money. In this case that we were looking at particularly on behalf of the FARC and the Sinaloa cartel. So what do? They set up a whole series of companies that don't exist. And simply by declaring it into their budget as stuff that they are doing, then that money is laundered into the system. So for example, in Nicaragua, my favorite case, Hugo Chavez and Daniel Ortega signed this big agreement to build a refinery for Venezuelan oil that will be in Nicaragua called the Sueño Supremo de Bolívar, Bolívar's supreme dream. And it's going to cost a magnificent sum of $4.6 billion. So every time I go to Nicaragua, I go by there, and on paper they have spent about $800 million now on this. It's an empty field with a few rusting oil cans and a sagging fence and one guard there. But every year it appears that on paper that they have invested another $200 or $300 million into that project. It's across the board with their solar panel projects, with almost everything they declare. It doesn't have to happen because no one is going to investigate the state when the state is controlled by a Bolivarian revolution, and they can declare essentially whatever the hell they want, and it becomes then legitimized into the political system. So that's one of the things that we're wrestling with, one of the things that Josh and his folks wrestle with a lot, and what DEA wrestles with a lot, because what we're seeing flowing into Central America, then back into Colombia, are the hundreds of millions, more like billions of dollars, that the FARC was able to bring out of Colombia, take to Central America, where they have their allies, into dollarized economy, push them in, and they do amazing things. The structure in El Salvador, supposedly based on Venezuelan oil that was being imported, which it wasn't. It was FARC money that began flowing in. They were growing enormously every year, even though oil prices fell and no oil was actually arriving. At the end of it, when all the money was essentially laundered through the system they wanted to do, what did they do? And it was brilliant. They declared themselves and their companies in El Salvador to be insolvent. They said, okay, these companies don't exist anymore. We loaned all that money out. We loaned $1.2 billion out. Well, who did they loan it to? To a series of companies they created in Panama that they controlled. So they took in $1.2 billion. They lent themselves $1.13 billion in those 8 companies that we were able to track. And it's a rather remarkable thing. That money's gone. It's flowed through Panama by the time we start looking at it. Nobody in El Salvador can get paid any of their social stuff that they'd accrued for working for these companies. And poof, like magic, is in the system and is virtually untraceable at that point. So that is the kind of problems we're facing in Latin America. And there's certainly other corruption issues. I think it's always important to say that the Bolivarian Revolution did not come out of nowhere, right? You had traditional political parties across the region, Bolivia, Ecuador, certainly Nicaragua, El Salvador, where the political elites had become diminished. They were no longer viewed as viable, legitimate, representing anything other than their own very specific interests, and the Bolivarians were the alternative that was supposed to save them. It didn't, the cure was worse than the disease, but it happened for a reason. People were thinking they were behaving in a politically rational way, and it didn't work out that way. But I think to look at the region now, you have to think and you have to look. And I work for the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats. And one of the things I do constantly, and this is why working with Josh and his people is interesting and fun because they get it, look for stuff that doesn't make sense. Look for large economic activity that is irrational because nobody carries out irrational activity knowingly. So what do you see in Bolivia? Multi-million, tens of millions of dollars spent on an airport in Oruro that has no flights coming in. You see stadiums built in the jungle to house 15,000 people in a village of 400 people. Gee, does that make sense? Probably not. Suriname announces building the largest gold refinery in the hemisphere in conjunction with a major money laundering operation out of the United Arab Emirates. Who the hell is going to send their gold to Suriname? There's no roads, no ports, and no direct flights to anywhere. Why would you do that? Does the refinery exist? No. It exists on paper so that people can move as much gold, real or fictitious, as they want through Suriname. So, but that is what happens when you have a state that's directly participating, because no one's going to go after it. So I'll leave it there and turn it over, but I think that if the magnitude of a multi-state criminal enterprise is new and challenging in ways that we as a government and I think across the globe, we have no mechanisms for dealing with that. We have no mechanisms of separating out those, calling those out from the herd and saying, we're not going to deal with them, or we're not going to recognize them, we can't take their passports, etc. We just don't have that way of doing things. And we better figure out something that will allow us to take a different tack with different types of legitimacies that are out there competing on the global stage for us to get our act together and be able to really go after the networks in ways to be effective.
No?
So I'm up. That's good. All right. I gotta stretch my legs for a minute. Hold on. I just retired from the Army, and I get stiff real easy nowadays. So I don't know what the problem is with that. I'm just gonna show you one slide, and then we'll get into some discussion. I want to have some time too for questions. There we go. I'm just gonna talk off of this. So my name is Bill Edwards. I'm a recently active Director of Intelligence for Special Operations Command North, which is the TSOC responsible to work hand in hand with U.S. Northcom and then also with U.S. SOCOM. So we had really two parents in our organization there that we were answering to, two different, our mom and dad relationship. And it was fascinating. I was brought in as the first colonel of the TSOC to stand up the Directorate of Intelligence. It was a new organization. And so I had this problem set that I walked into where the organization was growing. They had never had an intelligence function at that theater Special Operations Command for that specific AOR, and I had 4 people that I started to build from. So the reason I set the stage with you as that is I just wanted to give you some background on the specific area of responsibility I had at the time was what all these gentlemen are referring to and talking about, where there wasn't a lot of eyes actually going towards the problem, and then we were put into the mix to actually put some eyes on that problem set for the country, right? To give the commander of U.S. Northcom some time and space for decision making with regards to counterterrorism and other threats that were entering. So what I do now is I just transitioned into the private sector and commercial space, and I'm working for a company that actually does protective design. So it's a nice transition for me where I got to take skills that I have learned over the years and apply them now to the private sector and the commercial space, also working back to the department as well if necessary. So what I'm going to do is, and there's so many things I would like to talk about, but I know we're probably short on a little bit of time. But I wrote a lot of notes, and I'm going to sit down if you don't mind and go from here. But I want you to look at the chart I have up and look at this as a way of thinking. And I think it fits well into the theme that everyone has been talking about today is how do we think about the problem? And then how do we actually do something to get after it? So as a J2, that's what they call intel guys in the joint world, as the J2 responsible for intelligence in the U.S. Northcom AOR from a counterterrorism perspective, I sort of looked at my problem in these 5 steps. Okay, what are the things that you have to do? Well, we'll go through this quickly. You have to build your own collaborative network, your own blue network. You have to build out who you're going to work with, who you're going to communicate with, and how you're going to share information. That's number 1. And I use some examples here of whole of government approach. So that's DoD working with law enforcement, interagency, and you're collaborating collectively. Coalition partners and then willing partners. The other thing is you got to organize your specific internal organization as a network. You have to organize as a network in order to defeat a network or disrupt a network. And what we are dealing with is we're dealing with very, I would almost say, chaotic networks. If you've ever heard of the analogy where we had complicated problems when we first started our warfighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they sort of moved into complex, wicked. You've probably all heard the wicked problem. I think where we're at now is probably chaotic, almost chaotic problems, which are very, very, very hard to solve, but we can get after it. And so you organize internally so that you don't go with the typical Napoleonic staff structure and set yourself up in a line and block chart where the colonel's here and what you do is you organize your team so that it works together. Everyone has the ability to provide input to the actual problem set and then work collectively to actually come up with solutions, right? So I got it, I'm moving through. The other piece is you got to flatten communications. This is probably something that U.S. Special Forces does the best, which is communicate across your organizations with as much freedom as possible. So flatten your communications. And then the last bullet on that bullet there is empower your team, right? You can plan centrally, but always execute decentrally. What you're seeing in these chaotic, like I like to call chaotic networks and problems, is these organizations are executing decentrally. They're decentralized in how they execute. And so this is what makes it difficult. The last couple of things on this chart I just hit on real quick is data is very important in the world we live in now. Data is we have to understand data. And so it is very important, and what I wrote on there was one agency's throwaway may be another agency's gold. And so you can never discount the amount or the value of a piece of data because it may be valuable to me, but it may not be to someone else, okay? So we can build that picture. Last is analytics. You've got, at least in my world, I was a practitioner when I was operating as an intelligence director for a SOF unit. So I was in the mix. I was a practitioner. I was doing this day to day. The charts that Josh showed you earlier, we would develop that type of data for the operator so they could visualize exactly what the problem set is. That was my job. Give that visualization to the operators. And so that something can happen, right? So that there can be an action and sometimes an action is no action, but there has some decision cycle that's happening there. And so understanding analytics is very important. And then working multiple layers from different not threat streams, different data sources like finance. Finance is a layer. Biometrics is a layer. There's all kinds of different layers out there that you have to bring that all together in order to see the picture. And then lastly, you build that picture so that it's exploitable at some point, and then what you do is you go into network disrupt or network defeat. And a lot of times what we're doing is we're disrupting networks vice defeating them. It's very hard to defeat and destroy. If you look at the actual definitions of what that means from a military perspective, you're talking at some point, I think destroy might be 100% eliminating something. Well, you're not going to do that in these type of networks. You're going to do the strategic takeaways from each of them. What does all this mean? What are we trying to do? We're trying to give decision makers predictability. All we're trying to do is get ahead of that decision, and so that decision makers, it could be anyone. Think of a CEO of a company, or it could be a commander of a military organization, or a government official. But we're trying to give those people that predictable stance so that they can make the decision in a timely manner, which is really different than the reactionary mode we're often in when it comes to these type of networks. So as I walk through that, I want to hit a couple things on my notes here because I took some brilliant notes while you guys talked. But the digital domain is so critical. I just want to highlight that it's so critical we understand the digital domain. I won't go any further into that. You probably know what I'm talking about. Let me just kind of finalize here with a couple last things, but all of this has to come together so that we can succinctly understand the problem. Because at the end of the day, countering a threat network is about trying to understand the problem, at least from my perspective. And then getting into these areas which these gentlemen have talked about, which was a little bit new for us at the time, is now expanding. Some of the best partners we've had have been coalition partners, willing partners, outside of the whole government approach. And so that's where we actually make make some headway. So I will stop there. Again, this is just a way. I'm giving you a practitioner's way of thinking through how did I try to solve this problem from the position I was in, and then how did I build my team to organize against it, and then what was the end state? The end state was to give predictability to someone that can make a decision. So I think I'm probably good on 10 minutes, and I will stop there, and then hopefully we'll have some questions for all of us on the panel. And again, thank you for allowing me to just talk quickly about an approach, one way to look at a threat network.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody on the panel. I think some great ideas, great discussions. Ideas are what we keep coming back to here. It's the way of thinking about a new problem, a new and very complex problem. I don't think we have time for Q&A. I'm being told no. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to you guys.